Welcome back to the Gutshot podcast. We have the incredible privilege of welcoming Andrij Dobriansky to the pod. Andrij is the most visible face of Ukrainians in the US. 15 years of experience coordinating global campaigns at the UN. Highly sought after for viewpoints on the Ukraine, Russia, Eastern European culture, identity, as well as Catholic and Orthodox religious practices. Andrij, you've been on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS, and now you've got the honor of being on the Gutshot podcast with Simon and myself. We are broadcasting from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, where as a key country in the region, Southeast Asia, we've got over 600 million people directly or indirectly affected by geopolitical events in Europe and North America. Good to have you with us, Andrij. If we can, what were your viewpoints in terms of the perspective about what happened in Alaska between, the European leaders and Trump and Zelenskyy?
Yes, first of all, thank you guys for having me on. It's always a pleasure to reach new audiences. This has been a crazy week for me personally. I haven't had a lot of sleep this week with that same question that you just posed, which is what is happening and what has happened. We had the Alaska summit, which surprisingly came about a week after we heard about it. We heard about it late on a Friday in the United States, and then the following Friday, the president was already in Alaska. So it's a very short amount of time to put together an international meeting like this. Thankfully, it was done on a military base, which is a lot less security to deal with. It's already built into the process, including airspace restrictions. So the fact that they were able to put that together so quickly demonstrates that the White House has a capable team in terms of doing international summits like that on a very short order. What happened? The reaction of it was very negative. There weren't that many positives for the Alaska summit. In fact, I did a lot of conservative commentary on conservative outlets on Friday and Saturday, and the most positive aspect I heard was that President Trump had a longer red carpet than Putin, and that they were very impressed with the synchronized flyover of the B-2 bomber and the 4 F-35s overhead. Beyond that, there were no good talking points coming out because, unfortunately, I don't believe that President Trump's team coordinated enough with the media. I know that they had a splash in the New York Times talking about how the coordination of the flyover came out to be. I think they thought that would be much more spectacular, and in the end, Putin dismissed it with a shrug. Given the fact that he's been to front lines as opposed to President Trump, it's not as impressive to people who are around war zones. Absolutely spectacular flying. Let's not diminish that in any way. This was a team of 4 pilots who were circling, waiting for 2 presidential planes to land, and then they had to leave their planes, and then so they had a moving time of target, a moving TOT that they had to deliver and cross over. So absolutely spectacular piece of flying. However, what it gave us in the end, for I believe it was about $2 million just for that 90 seconds overhead, it really didn't do anything. Once the whole goal was to maybe impress President Putin. Not quite sure. Also, a flyover like that, we have it in stadiums, we have it at independence events in the United States. That's done as a sign of honor. So the addition of the flyover, as well as an honor guard saluting a man who is a wanted war criminal, also brought up questions, again, because a lot of advance work wasn't done with the press. And that really was the big crime of the event. Not a crime, but I'm just being hyperbolic here. President Trump has had a war with his DC press corps. He does not like the press pool that is assigned to him by the press in DC. He wants to change it. We've seen it very obviously who he lets into the White House, but his team does not coordinate well with White House reporters, and that is a problem when you go overseas. This has been talked about by presidential historians over the years. Whenever you have an overseas visit, you want your press corps to work hand in glove with your administration, because the other side is always going to be doing that. And here, especially, you have Russia, who had several hundred, I believe 200 to 300 visas issued. They requested 200 to 300 visas just for this event for their press and their diplomats. So they had an entire team of what I consider to be propagandists they were being fed lines to distribute to their outlets, but those were the only people that were communicating with people inside the room. So the Western press, the White House press who traveled to Alaska, did not get a press conference, didn't get an exclusive like Sean Hannity did or Brett Baer. They were left, the only resource for them to do their reporting were the Russian quote unquote journalists. So again, the White House messed up not only by not having the correct talking points in advance, but during the entire day, they weren't feeding information, leaking how strong President Trump was, what he was doing right in the room. Yes, the press can manipulate that in ways otherwise, but they were left with zero information. And therefore, all they had were the talking points coming out of these Russian journalists. So that was a mistake. And in general, that's the mood I got making my appearances in Europe and in Ukraine on television stations, as well as on American television stations. And I generally did mostly conservative outlets that day. And, you know, I did not hear that many positive things. That completely changed on Monday. Monday was a great success story. Much more communication with the press, many more exclusive pictures that are still coming out to this day, showing President Trump in private, candid moments with leaders. In fact, the White House social media is putting out more and more pictures and little snippets of video about how that day went. And that's how you dominate the media. And this is the failure of Alaska was a failure of media control or dominating the media narrative. And that was culminated with the press conference at the end, which wasn't a press conference, there was no questions, but also President Trump he was not at his best. President Trump is best when he is full of energy, when he is engaging in people. So questions actually help him because they raise his energy level. He read something, and when he's hunched over and reading, he's not powerful looking. President Putin read something also, but for a short guy, he's always puffing out his chest to try to look as tall as everybody else. So President Trump was low energy, did not engage with anybody, and therefore he ended on a low note. And that's something that they tried to fix in Washington, and I think they did. Unfortunately, the last thing I'll say is that the president has stepped on all of the victories of Monday, where he was being hailed across the world as an incredibly dominant leader, somebody who is working towards the future, because he started calling in to different radio shows the following day. So he called into Fox and Friends. He changed a lot of the rhetoric that came out of the White House on Monday. He also called into Mark Levin yesterday, another conservative host, where he also went on many different tangents and wasn't on message. We know the people who love Trump love that he talks about anything and everything, but after a major international summit or any major event, you want to be sticking on your talking points to demonstrate how successful things were, and that's what didn't happen, unfortunately.
Sam?
Yeah, I didn't have much time. I mean, I'm in DC doing joy walking, as they say, right? Yesterday had a full day of a museum, and keeping the wife happy for the week after last week's neglection. So I didn't get much coverage, Andre, unlike when I'm home. So when you say he was not on message, I really want to understand what you mean by after Monday he was not on message specifically. Maybe you can give me one or two examples you consider that he dropped the ball after Monday.
Well, in terms of not being on message, in diplomacy, you want to be vague about things, and that makes more people on board with everything. Same thing in politics. You want to be not too specific. And when he started on Monday talking about no troops on the ground, no, we're not going to do this, no, we're not going to do this, that took away from the unity of saying all the European leaders said, we're going to do something on security guarantees. That was the major change in the narrative. The wake-up call to the world and Russia itself going, oh, okay, America's serious, they're going to be doing something. But when you cut it down by saying we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, all of a sudden it takes away from the unity message where all the leaders are saying the same things, because all the European leaders can say the same thing. Well, we don't want to do this, or we're only going to say Five Guys, we're only going to do. That's not the message you want to put. You want to be saying for the entire week, we have security guarantees, you better show us an option, Putin, to give us something, because again, up until this point, we haven't had any concessions made by Putin anything showing that he's willing to have a conversation, not least of which is what was underscored at the meeting was there's currently no ceasefire. And this has been the one thing that President Trump has tried to get since February. This isn't the first time that he spoke with him at Alaska. He's had long 2-3 hour discussions every month since February. And the one thing he's been asking for is a ceasefire, and Putin has refused to budge.
So there's
you want
there's a bit of the
before
Sopranos.
I come in, yeah.
So Andre, there's a bit of the Sopranos about this whole thing because on the Financial Times reported on Monday, revealing a document actually which suggested that Zelenskyy would buy through European financial aid $100 billion of American weaponry in return for security guarantees from the US. So it's a little bit like you've got to pay tit for tat where you're buying American security, and so I mean. So optics aside, I think we're trying to understand what this all means from ASEAN perspective, and is there like an element of financial market wizardry here, where obviously the whole war machine, security guarantees, the militia, all that is involved. I mean, there's a financial element to all this. I mean, what are we to read about these developments?
I think the financial, what you're referencing, that $100 billion deal paid for with European funds, the weapons going directly to Ukraine, I think that is, as we have seen, the need for any country in the world to offer some kind of sweeteners to keeping President Trump's attention and willingness to go on with something. We've seen this in every tariff deal where there are sweeteners involved in investments in the United States. That's the only way that there will be a tariff or a trade agreement signed with a bilateral trade agreement with different countries. So here again, I think this is very similar to the discussion about the minerals deal. This is something that caught the attention. This was something that interested President Trump. He wanted it to happen, but it was proposed before President Trump came into office. This is an idea that's been bandied about. But when President Trump came to office, I think the Ukrainian side and others knew that this is something he would be interested in. And so it was proposed and he went along with it. Same thing here. President Trump is more interested in anything that he can post as an accomplishment for the American people where he's bringing money in. And a deal where weapons are going to be purchased is much favorable to the United States in his mind, as opposed to what we've been doing, which is sending depleted stock from our warehouses and replenishing that in the United States stock. A plan that has been so successful that it's actually the basis for what President Trump proposed with NATO last month. Basically, what NATO countries are going to do is the same thing that the United States has been doing, which is sending whatever stock they have in their own warehouses already, munitions, vehicles, what have you, and then they will buy with very much less red tape and much easier to replenish from American manufacturers their storehouses. So that system that was worked out in the previous administration was so successful that President Trump has basically expanded it to European nations, cutting down red tape, cutting down permissions for exporting to them, and now he's looking for something else on top of that. So not only is it Europe going to be buying, is offered the ability to buy, now they are putting down on paper that they will, through Ukraine, purchase $100 billion, which is, again, he needs political wins to figure out a way to keep this going.
Chuang, can I pull back the discussion a bit and take a bit more macro picture? Because I understand Andrej's point with respect to the optics and all that, but with Trump, normally I put aside the optics because the optics can be quite either you're going to have a lot of bling or a lot of distractions, so to speak. So I tend to actually look at what's the bottom line that's going to be achieved, if there is, right? So when I look at this, my first thought was actually he wanted to get Putin into a discussion as soon as he could, on a one-to-one basis, physically. I think it's typical business mentality, which is, rather than have all your people work out the details, you get on to the decision maker and see whether you can work out a way forward with the decision maker. So that's the first thing I thought when I saw the Alaska summit being cobbled up pretty fast. That's number one. Secondly, I thought that the interesting part about the ceasefire, the mainstream media, I think, have made a big deal out of the ceasefire not being there. And Trump has been saying that he doesn't really need a ceasefire. So there may be a change that that some has been negative about. But again, I go to the bottom line, because what I see in how he handles things is actually, it's the typical business pivot of, whatever that's going to make it work. Now, when I peel back, and I think my thoughts are, number one, he's already stated up front, this is not my war. This is Biden's war. Right? Andre, am I couching it correctly? That's about what he has been saying.
Yeah, I have a couple of responses. So let's start with the Biden's
Sure.
war, and we can go back to it. But
Right.
this war, the last 6 months of 2024, there were 11,000 pieces of munitions, that's ballistic missiles and bombs, dropped on Ukraine. In the first 6 months of 2025, there are 27,000. There are 40% more civilian casualties over the last 3 months, 40% more children specifically as casualties. And last month, July, was registered by the UN Office on Human Rights as the deadliest month for casualties since May of 2022. So whatever was happening in 2024 and who was in charge there, it is definitely a hotter war now. And the president, who is the president, is President Trump. Going on to ceasefire, the conversation in 2024 was not centered around ceasefire. That was a Trump initiative. Trump was the one who approached Ukraine and said, I want a ceasefire now. He cut off military supplies. He cut off military intelligence, target intelligence, which directly led to a loss of Ukrainian territory on Russian land. And he is the one who's been driving ceasefire for 5 months. It is only in the last couple of weeks that he, after, especially since talking to Putin, where he dropped the conditions for ceasefire and said, we're going to go to a plan after being proposed by Putin. It's frankly a Putin plan to go to a final plan, not President Trump's, because on the Wednesday before the 2 days before the Alaska summit, he had an international call with European leaders. They put down 5 points that they all agreed to, America with the European leaders. And first was ceasefire now. So Trump has been driving the ceasefire now. That's why it was included in the European demands. It was because that was a Trump issue. And he is the one who changed his mind. So this is one of those things where Trump does announce something, and then when he has a radical change from not doing a ceasefire to something else, he's going to get called on it, whether by pundits or media from time to time.
So
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that part. Chuang, go ahead.
yeah, gentlemen, I just like to return to first principles if possible, and try and just make it palatable for the layman. And if we can just have a quick examination of why Vladimir Putin did what he did in the first place, and what Zelensky is trying to achieve, and whether those top 3 bullet points can actually be met in the middle in terms of a compromise, and how far are we from those that Venn diagram being achieved?
We're still far. We're still far. I think Secretary of State Rubio was the most calm and level-headed voice after the Alaska summit, where he just tried to slow everybody down, because President Trump was doing his social media. Steve Witkoff was doing media interviews talking about things that he still doesn't understand. And Marco Rubio was just saying, we are in the first steps of having a discussion. This was after Alaska. We're just beginning the conversation. There's no, in Marco Rubio's mind, we're not at the final decision yet. We are just beginning the conversation. And that's frankly what happens in diplomacy. It's a long slog. President Trump likes to talk about the peace agreements that have been signed at the White House. Those have been in the works for months. The Rwanda and Congo peace deal, the State Department was working on this for 18 months before President Trump became president. And it was only the final push by President Trump that got it over the line. But still, there's a lot of diplomatic work that needs to be done, the boring work. And we're not at the boring work section of the Ukraine, the attack against Ukraine. There needs to be a lot of work by diplomats and negotiators to figure out exactly what we're talking about, this 1,000 miles of demarcation of the front line, what we're talking about in terms of who stays on what side of what border. So in terms of, for the layman to understand, why Putin started this, Putin does not consider Ukraine to be a people. And that is from the top down, vertically, put down into his population, to the extent that we know that Russian soldiers, because we have the recordings of their wives calling them and saying, whatever you do in Ukraine, raping women, that's fine by me. They don't consider these people, this other nation, a people. We even saw this in Alaska, where President Putin was trying to say that, well, I may be comfortable with them speaking in their own language in their own country, or I may be comfortable with them having their own church in their own country as part of a negotiating point. So in the end, it comes down to not acknowledging Ukraine as its own separate country. His people have also, all on Russian television over the last month, have been saying this about the 3 Baltic countries as well, that they're not real countries, they're just an offshoot of our old Russian Empire, and that we should actually have that territory as well. So it stems from the fact that there is a long-standing, at times throughout Russian history, there are some reformers, but always the empire side of the equation dominates whenever that is politically feasible to use that as an excuse to rally. It's happened several times over the centuries, but notably here, we know that Putin increased the military thoughts of rhetoric when he came into office. He cut down any reformers, literally assassinating many people who were doing reforms in the state parliament of Russia in the early 2000s. And then from then on, it's just been military attack against military attack against people within the Russian Federation, whether they're ethnic Chechens, and the leveling of Grozny, the attack on Georgia in 2008 across his border. Russia has military troops in 8 different conflict zones, 9 conflict zones since 2022, that are just, constantly expanding. And there's no reason to think that this won't expand further, given the fact that he's now consolidated even the mercenary forces that used to work in Africa and other places. He's consolidated them into the armed forces of Russia. And so everything now works directly under a power vertical, meaning President Putin is really the one who dictates where his forces, whether they're mercenaries or armed forces of Russia, wherever in the world, he's controlling that. And Ukraine will be a fundamental part of this. There is no backing down from Ukraine for Putin. It has been a fundamental strategy and a talking point of his from the very beginning. And so I don't see a situation where President Putin meets with President Zelenskyy. He would be, in Putin's mind, lowering himself to somebody he doesn't recognize. We had the one meeting in 2019 where he was just, President Putin didn't know even how to talk to President Zelenskyy. And then furthermore, every day that we go further from that Washington summit and the Alaska summit, we hear less and less interest from Russia about sitting down like President Trump wanted.
No, I'm looking at this, and I mean, in spite of all that, the question actually that comes to my mind is what's next? Because there are a few basic points, if I think about it, in order for this conflict to be resolved, regardless. Because I think from a Russian standpoint, Putin will go all the way if he has to, right? Mm-hmm. So we recognize that fact. Okay, so recognizing that fact that they'll put through their people on a meat grinder, and they have enough people to overrun Ukraine.
Maybe.
There you go. Right. So that's one. The second thing is, how long do we want this meat grinder to continue? Right. So if you take the head to say that the position is, this is not my war, this is a war that I want to end, then there must be concessions by both parties, right? By both parties to some extent. The problem is really, actually, I see that that Russia has got the upper hand with respect to territory and the power dynamics, if you ask me. So then the question becomes, how much is Ukraine willing to concede in order to stop the bloodshed? And then how do you stop this from happening again, which is what you mentioned, Andrij, which is basically the security guarantee. Am I right to put this and say this is the two main issues as far as I look at it?
Well,
Right or
there's
wrong?
also
How do you see it?
we've had three international peace summits organized by Ukraine, where one had 80 countries, one had, there's different numbers of people attending every year. There's been a separate summit in the Middle East with Saudi Arabia and other people. What do they see as the future of Ukraine? Because this is not just a Ukraine-Russia issue. There are a lot of countries that are looking at this, not least China, but a lot of countries around the world who are looking at what happens here, because we haven't had this in such a way, especially in Europe. And the war in Europe is what caused the United Nations to come into place, a lot of international agreements to come into place, that people are looking like, if this can happen in Europe, which is where we said it wouldn't happen again, which is military takeover and annexing of other territory, then the basis of the world order, whether it's the UN Charter, whether it's the Helsinki format, numerous international agreements are based on this. And people can talk about China and Taiwan, sure, but really, I always go back to African countries. The ambassador of Kenya, when Ukraine was invaded in 2022, was like, we didn't draw our borders. Those were the borders that were given to us by the empires who occupied us. If we were to start saying that in Africa, we need to start changing borders based on ethnicities and the right that these are traditionally our people, we would send our entire continent down a path of war for over 100 years. And that's the case for many places in the world. So I think we are so far removed, in many places in the world are so far removed, especially the wealthier countries are so far removed from world war, or because many countries have been involved in other wars, civil wars and others. But I don't think people really understand what it would be like to return to the 19th century, where we had wars of conquest happening regularly, where the seas, you couldn't send your ship overseas without being worried that your goods or your people would be captured. This is the question when Donald Trump says that he wants to go back to another era where we're not dominated by international agreements, but more one-on-one agreements, that I worry about, because we haven't had that in over a century. And we know that the last time we had that, we came into a system where world powers were divided into blocks, and all of a sudden they started, going at each other. Here, we don't have blocks going at each other. We have rogue states. We have China that's a rogue state. We have Iran that's a rogue state. North Korea that's a rogue state. Syria before the current revolution. There are rogue states out there, and the world hasn't figured out how to deal with them. There have been sanctions regimes. There have been cutting them out of different deals. But Russia has never been treated as a pariah in the way that those other countries, North Korea and others. The United States signed an international agreement with Russia during the war. During 2023, they signed an international agreement to continue sending astronauts through Russia to the International Space Station. There's been no cutoff.
The Europeans, the Europeans are also, still importing energy from Russia.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what I'm saying. So it's never been cut off like a pariah.
Right. Well, you think about it. So is China. Nobody's cutting off really China either.
No,
right?
No, not at all.
So we spoke about in previous episode about a resetting of the global of global trade. In essence, this is in a way also a resetting of global geopolitics and power dynamics. Right. That's the way I see it. And I think each area has to be handled differently. China, if you ask me, you're looking at merchant commerce, maritime commerce protection that needs to happen, because you need the Straits of Taiwan and the surrounding area to be peaceful, right? In Europe, so you've got a different dynamic and especially when you have a president that is willing to take action, then it at least prevents the other party from taking the first unilateral action, which is what happened, in my opinion. We can go into this argument, but I would rather not go down that rabbit hole, which is basically, I think, in the case of Ukraine, it's basically the cookie has been, to a certain extent, baked right now after a decade. You know, from Obama, then Trump, and we got a pause, and then Biden, and then we got another fight, right? So now what the question is actually, how do we get back? And the only way I can see to getting back with respect to Ukraine is they're going to be, how much do you think Ukraine is willing to concede with respect to territory? So I'm really going to the nuts and bolts, because I think that the security guarantee is something that is going to be a prerequisite, right? So that's going to be a
Yes.
prerequisite from the Europeans and from the Americans, right? So I think that will have to be in place. But then with that in place, what kind of territorial concession are they willing to do with Russia?
I think that
Or are they
depends on
willing
what
to do at all?
I think that depends on what kind of concessions Russia is bringing to the table. Understanding that there are numerous war crimes to deal with, are they sending any Russian officers off to The Hague to be prosecuted for the sexual violence? Are they releasing any of the 20,000 children that are currently kidnapped in Russia? There was just a website launched last week before the Alaska summit where Russian parents can go online and pick the kidnapped Ukrainian child to adopt. So there are things outside of land and war that are also need to be discussed, because I mentioned 3 different international peace summits that happened since 2022. One of the things that were discussed by many nations, because all nations need to back this up, it's not just the security agrees by NATO, but all nations need to agree that this is a just peace. Otherwise, you know, we have had resolution after resolution at the UN where over 140 countries condemn this and want specific actions happen. So how do we reconcile this? And one of them would be a just peace. And the just peace has to do with what is the kind of justice that is happening. Is President Putin still going to be a war criminal after this? We still have obviously the nearly 300 people that were shot down over Ukraine that still haven't received justice for the killing in 2014. There are so many things that haven't been adjudicated that are also a part of this discussion, because we can't just say territory, peacekeeping, end of discussion. Yes, we have had unjust peace in the world, but there are so many. This has upended so many lives that this doesn't guarantee a calm peace. And what we need is not just security guarantees from Europe and concession from Ukraine, but we need to have an understanding about justice will be happening. Otherwise, you get into vigilante murders, you get to reprisal campaigns of bombings all over the place. This is what happens when you don't have a just peace.
Well, Chuang, you wanna butt in? No, I'm blessed. It's this whole well, as they call it, the fog of war, right? You know, you really have a situation that you're not gonna have 100% satisfaction from either party, if you ask me. And especially if you look at it from the point of view of the Ukrainians, I don't think that will come about, if you ask me, because you're not going to be able to enter into peace if you still have Putin being labeled or being designated as a war criminal. That's not going to happen.
Then what happens
Just
with the
take,
war
let's
crimes
take,
what would you do with the war crimes that were made then? Were you just going to, because they've all been filed and recognized, is somebody going to say, please don't prosecute? Like who makes that decision?
well, for one, the international
Court of Justice,
what's that?
ICJ.
Yeah,
ICJ,
the
International
ICJ.
Court of Justice. Yeah.
Yeah, the ICJ is not recognized by the US, isn't it? That's one issue.
It's not that it's not recognized; it wasn't ratified by the Congress. So
Well, it's not recognized then, buddy.
No, meaning that they won't enforce the warrants and stuff. But that doesn't mean that it's not an international warrant. So,
Right.
Putin can't fly to over 100 countries. What changes that?
I know. So here's the thing. I mean, at the end of the day, it's either something's got to give or nothing gives, and the meat grinder continues.
Right. And so we have heard that Ukraine was ready to give a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. We have heard that Ukraine was ready to sit down. They sat down twice in Istanbul with going back and forth, and Russia wasn't offering anything. Russia is continuing to, if you're talking about an intractable partner in a business discussion, Russia is continuing to put down the terms that they put down the day they invaded. There are no changes in their terms.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I don't think we can adjudicate the peace deal though over here, right? Between us talking about it. But definitely I see that there are few main principal items. For example, if you talk about missing children, that will be part of the discussion, obviously, right?
Yes. And that has been part of the discussion. That was part of, when President Trump says, "I want you to meet in Istanbul with President Putin," and Zelensky got on a plane. President Putin didn't show up. His foreign minister didn't show up. But there were three meetings held in Istanbul. And during those meetings, Ukraine put down not the 20,000. They put down a list of 339 children, and they asked, "Can you return these children as a sign of good faith, as a negotiating, and then we will do something in return as well." And Russia hasn't even responded to that request.
Yeah. So I think we've come a point. I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at it with all the flurry of activities. It at least actually to me, the first time in 4.5 years that there seemed to be a real push at peace. So I think we'll have to see what happens next within the next couple of weeks at least, and see where this whole thing is going. I think.
Can I just add I agree with you. This is the first time we've seen progress at kind of meetings, but also this can all go away very quickly, just as quickly as it started. And you can look back to the fact that nobody talked with North Korea for how many decades, and President Trump did 2 major summits, and at the end of it, he just walked away. He said, North Korea is intractable. We're not moving forward with the deal.
Just trying to understand the tea leaves and what's going on. Look, Donald Trump calls European leaders, including Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Vladimir Zelenskyy, Vladimir Putin. They all land in Alaska on American territory. They subject themselves to the perceived humility of B-2 bombers flying over their heads, and it's a show of strength. Let's call it that. It's theatrics, right? What role does America play in adjudicating a peace treaty between these two warring nations? Because they came. He called and they came. So they obviously they appear to be of the belief that maybe America can do something. And what can America offer to make both sides come to the peace table? I think that's the key point. Because for us in ASEAN, a continued conflict in the Ukraine does not give us any benefits. Obviously we've got increased prices in terms of a lot of goods. This latest tariff threats by America on India does not bode well for us in this part of the world. We don't want to see more conflict, let alone in our part of the woods, right? So what can America bring to the table in terms of adjudicating this peace treaty?
Well, let's understand what the conflict is today. Obviously, I mentioned at the beginning that we have an increased amount of bombings, more than double in the first 6 months of 2025 than we did in the last 6 months of 2024. But let's go back to 2022, which is where we are in terms of civilian casualties. Civilian casualties in July in Ukraine are at the level they were in May of 2022, just a few months after the conflict began, or the full-fledged invasion began. And at that point, everybody around the world was reacting in despair, because there's a difference between when Ukraine gets invaded or another similar country and say what happens in the Sudan or what happens in the Congo, meaning that Ukraine is tied into the international economic system in a much different way than some of these countries. The very first thing that the United Nations was pulling their hair out is what to do with all the food that Ukraine exports. And that's because a lot of the grain is purchased in Middle Eastern countries, in Northern African countries, and some South Asian countries as well. And that the fact that Ukraine was invaded, obviously no air travel happened. the rail travel continue for a bit. Roads were uncertain at the beginning of the war, which ones were going to be bombed, which ones were going to be potentially treacherous for trucks to go through. So all of a sudden, we had no idea how the food was getting exported. That's why in the first legislation that the United States passed after the war began to send aid to Ukraine, they actually included international development money for Africa and many Middle East countries for increased fertilizer, increased farm development, increased money for them to purchase food. Because what the United States was worried about, and many world leaders, this is why they were having meetings at the UN, is the domino effect. What happens when a small country in the Middle East or Northern Africa all of a sudden has a run on its food, prices are skyrocketing, the government can't keep a hold, riots begin, and all of a sudden that spills over into another country and another country and another country. So when we talk about why we need to be aware of this, we need to be aware of what the status is of the war right now, or let's say at the end of 2024, it felt like there was a stalemate developing, but Russia is not satisfied with the stalemate, and they are actually increasing their production. They've imported 25,000 workers from North Korea to increase their production of the Shahed drone technology they got from Iran. So they want to be able to fire 1,000 drones on Ukraine on a regular basis. They want to, just yesterday, they fired on a Ukrainian oil depot 2 days ago while the summit was happening in the White House. They bombed a Azerbaijan oil depot in Odessa. This is the same country that was involved in the peace deal signed at the White House, and is a big key to the future of oil and natural gas coming from the Central Asian countries, bypassing Russia and going straight to Europe. This is part of what the White House and Europe has been working towards, and Russia is attacking that, not necessarily Ukraine. Ukraine domestic supply is almost nothing in terms of oil. They are attacking foreign countries' oil depots on Ukrainian territory. So this is why when we say why we need to be worried, we're worried about the spillover effects. We're worried about, say, when people talk about cutting off Russian oil, well, we know what that means. That means the price of oil around the world goes up. So there are the spillover effects that we want to be able to contain either in a stalemate or into a final resolution, whichever works out better for the world.
Is there any sign of a stalemate at this point in time? Because the temperature that I'm getting from the both of you discussing this is that we're very, very far off from any kind of peace treaty or even any kind of talks being. So I think the real question is what happens next, Andrij? What happens next?
What happens next is that Russia has been using less of its mechanized vehicles. They've lost over 20,000 mechanized vehicles, tanks, and armored carriers, but they've been using the ones they have in reserve less, and they've been probing the Ukrainian front lines with these salients, with just a group of a platoon of soldiers here, a brigade here, and they're trying to figure out where the front line is the weakest. And they haven't been using specifically their military equipment. They have been using that in reserve until they can build up and scrounge up enough, because they're looking at what older the equipment they use to do a bigger push. That is what Ukrainian intelligence sources say. That is what Western intelligence sources say. If that comes to be, who knows? But that is what the tea leaves are telling us, that a bigger push is happening out of Putin, and he's obviously not slowing down, as I just mentioned, the production of the glide bombs, the missile technology, as well as the drones. So at this point, Russia is seeing no evidence that they want to stop this conflict. They are increasing their conscription of people, and therefore the only natural response for the West is to increase their support of Ukraine, either in additional military aid, ratcheting up sanctions against Russia for them to be hurt more, because we know that also by the end of the year, Russian GDP is supposed to go down to zero in GDP growth. Sorry, Russian GDP growth has been slowing down. I think it's down to less than 2% now from, I think at the beginning of 24, they were at 4% or 5% even. So even with the sanctions, they were still growing their GDP. It's going to go down to zero by the end of the year. And then it's a question of what happens at that point. But in between now and then, there could be a major additional military offensive by Russia.
So here's my question, Andrij. War is not cheap, and the money's got to come from somewhere. And if, obviously, right, if America imposes the sanctions that it wants on India, and that's what it wants the Indians to pay, if conceivably India stops buying Russian oil, And China continues to buy Russian oil as it can because obviously China does what China does, right? Does it then increase tensions between the U.S. and China? And if that happens, then what happens after that? Because I mean, we're just trying to think maybe chess-wise 4 or 5 steps ahead, because if what you say is true and Russia continues to want its land back, it's got to pay for it somehow, right? And then what happens after that?
The chess with China is that China has openly said more than once this summer that they do not want to see Russia lose. But much like Biden and Ukraine, they're not saying that they want to see Russia win. So it seems like China is happy with things going in exactly the way they're going now. Both Russia and the United States spending money, spending resources, and people, especially on the Russian side, losing people. China would be happy with less Russian soldiers, less Russian resources in terms of money and capital, and more reliant on more and more resources from China. This is also a conversation I've had with some people. Russia at the beginning had stockpiles of material. It could be the 20,000 tanks I said that have been destroyed, and military carrier, any mechanized vehicle. They've lost 20,000 plus. Bombers, we know, other equipment that they can't replace very quickly, but especially the munitions, they have been turning more and more to these other states. They've been turning to North Korea, either manufacturing their drones or purchasing shells for their howitzers to attack on artillery. 80% of some of these Shahed pieces or the drone pieces are being sourced with chips and other material from China. United States has called that out directly at the UN Security Council. Iran also still a partner for aid, any weapons, etc. These countries I just named, you can't just call them up and say, by the way, North Korea and China, we're going to stop the war. Russia is already in bed with mobsters. they're mobsters.
Andrij,
yeah,
Andrij, can I do this then? Can I do this then? I'm going to play very Machiavellian in terms of my thought process. All right. And put myself in the position of a businessman president who says this is not my war, and I want to actually I got to play this chess, which is what is my bigger chess pieces that I've got to worry about. I got to be worried about China. I got to be worried about Russia. That's my 2 biggest problem. All right, if I were to look at it, right? I don't want to push India into the Russian bed. Okay, so what am I going? Right. What should I do? So if I look at it, I said, okay, the Europeans, and I go back to just a quick digression, which is in essence, I would feel that this is a European war plus my predecessor's war. So what I'm going to see is actually I'm going to stop it no matter what. Right? Okay. So that I don't have to impose sanctions on countries like India that is buying Russian oil, right? And then I would integrate Russian economy into the global economy, whether war criminal or not, because all I want to do is actually to increase the global GDP, right?
Can you name some things from the Russian economy that could be integrated though?
Oil.
Okay.
Oil and gas. Because why? If I have to impose sanctions on India for buying sanctioned oil from Russia, it's already creating a huge problem in terms of trade, and India is just one. I've got to deal with China, and China is going to keep on buying, right? So, and then what happens? It floods the market later on transshipment, that I can't control, right? So I would rather see a controlled commerce, number one. Number two, I would rather take Russia out from a BRICS economy.
Okay.
Right? So if I were to do that, I would go to Zelenskyy and say, hey, buddy, these are the things that you got to concede, and these are the things I will help you I will help you get. and get to the end of this war as quickly as I can. That's the way I see how
Well,
things are going.
you still are assuming that Russia's going to go with this, though.
I am assuming I have to take that gamble. So, I mean,
Okay.
Andre, I have to take that gamble, right?
Yeah.
Because
but right now there's no even hint that Russia is interested in stopping the war or interested in coming to any deal. They're in their mind, they are the dominant one. They're the ones that have nothing to lose here.
Well, if I were in Putin's shoes, then I mean, the way I see, I mean, I'm just looking at it, you know, from do I really want to fight this? If I've already got the ones that I'm reasonably happy with, and I've got to get richer and more stable economy by reintegrating my country into the global market, that would be an incentive enough for me to look at it, actually, rather than
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I agree.
These are the chess pieces, I would think, right?
Yeah.
Which means,
my counterpoint is I just don't see Russia at this point today or to the end of the year stopping whatever they're doing. Maybe Putin changes his mind. We just haven't seen any indication that Russia is interested in stopping, even with the sweeteners you said. Because
let me ask you a question then. Since Alaska, have there been any more flare-ups?
Oh yeah, no. Russia has increased. Last night was horrible in Ukraine. In terms of ballistic missiles. So during Alaska, while they were in the room, Russia launched its drone while Trump was speaking to Putin. Russia launched its drone attacks on Ukraine. While they were in the White House, the European leaders and President Trump went to speak with Putin, he launched his bombers to attack Ukraine. All of these things are happening on and the Azerbaijan oil depot in Odessa, that happened when they were in the White House. This is one of the major deals that Trump is talking about every day, that he made peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Russia is attacking the oil resources of Azerbaijan. So this is happening no matter what. Like, you would think we would see something from Putin going, I'm going to stop doing this, or I'm going to stop killing children or women or whatever, things that upset Trump. But he's doing the exact opposite for some reason. And I don't know why.
John?
I'm quite concerned, obviously, right? Doesn't bode well.
Oh, you humanitarian, you. Go ahead, Gary.
I mean, obviously, the 60s, they got it right? Make love, not war. But I just, so Andrij, I'm looking at the poly market odds, right? And for the longest time, poly market was actually quite pessimistic about some kind of resolution. But in the last few weeks, poly market odds have seemed to increase in favor of some kind of.
Oh, you went muted for a second.
Yeah, why do you think the odds have increased? I mean, Alaska.
Because of the summits. Because of the summits. Because there was actually talks happening. That's the big difference between the beginning of the year and now. Even Zelenskyy coming to the White House and then Zelenskyy agreeing to a 30-day ceasefire, that didn't move the markets because there was no summit, there was no conversation. I think Alaska summit changed that. I think that apart from all the negative said about the media attention on it and how the White House could have done a better job controlling the media narrative, I think there was some progress made during that summit. But in the end, there's no way that it doesn't seem like they have tied in Putin to any kind of commitment to go further, because everything we're seeing and hearing day after day after the Alaska summit is Lavrov doesn't want to meet anytime soon with the Ukrainians. Putin doesn't want to meet anytime soon with the Ukrainians. So I agree with you that what Polymarket was reacting was the fact that there was a conversation. There was actually people talking with each other, but it doesn't seem like anything that they discussed was enough to put down on paper to say, we are committed to do 1, 2, 3 things in the next 3 months.
So if you are a money market allocator, right? If you're a fund allocator, how would you position your capital into the end of this year? How would you, if you were I've just met you, Andrij, a couple of weeks ago, right? If you were a betting man, how would you position yourself?
Listen, I was saying when Crimea was invaded that I would still bet on Ukraine and bet on investment there. So I'm always looking at the biggest possible pot. And in fact, Washington is going to have the first of its kind reconstruction summit, because there have been international reconstruction summits, but there are a lot of people from the MAGA side of the aisle, America First side of the aisle, that are interested. If Trump makes peace, what kind of investment opportunities would there be for American companies? A lot of people don't understand that Ukraine, how integrated. I mentioned everybody knows that Ukraine's the bread basket and does food, but Ukraine was such a big outsourcer for different IT needs. The majority of logistics for Amazon was being run out of a third party in Ukraine for all of Europe. There are obviously all the startups that happen from Ukrainians that have exploded in Silicon Valley over the years. And then what we're seeing with this drone innovation, this is one of the reasons that President Trump is interested in signing a deal with Ukraine, because it's not just the innovation, it's the testing it in real life environments that the United States is getting the benefit of. What happened with the Patriot missile system, which is the unrivaled defense system for shooting down rockets that are being sent at you. The rockets that Iran sent at the bases that America had in the Middle East, they performed better because their computers had been updated with all the rocket attacks that the Patriots in Kiev had been doing, shooting down Russian rockets. So it's about the on-the-ground, real-time experience with a lot of these technologies. I was on the ground in Ukraine in 2023 with different American delegations. I was there since 2022 on different American delegations. And from the very beginning, there have been massive interest in right now, Ukraine has no air flights over it. Obviously, no domestic kind of flights are going to go. And so outside firms were interested in developing their drone technology, not for military, but for delivery services. So given the fact that it's going to take, let's say they sign a peace deal today, there's no way that Ukraine can open up its airports for another 5 or 6 months in terms of staffing, in terms of security procedures, et cetera. We might have a period where what the outside Western drone makers were interested in, which is right now they are limited to a ceiling, I think, of 500 feet or something in the United States. I don't remember, but they can test their delivery services in an environment where it's open skies. They don't have to worry about crashing into airplanes and go forward. So for me, when you're talking about investment, my first thoughts are about what happens in terms of reconstruction, because it's not going to be a Marshall Plan where there's a big pile of money that the United States gave to Europe. And one of the reasons we gave it to Europe is so that there were no repercussions. Like, listen, the United States is going to help you rebuild. Don't start killing each other, again, in terms of which country got worse and best. And in this sense, it's going to be much more of an investment opportunity for people, because you're talking about rebuilding a society that has, let's say, a lot of coal-fired plants or nuclear plants that are 10 years past their operating license. There's going to be jumping from, let's say 1.0 to 3.0 before even using 2.0 technology. So that's where I think a lot of international investment is going to be interested. I'm going to be interested in this Washington, D.C. summit on September 13th and 14th to see what, especially kind of MAGA interested tech right people are interested in investment in Ukraine, because the number one thing that this ties into globally is that the United States is dead set against any Chinese investment into Ukraine, peace or not. This is something that they've made a red line. In fact, the minerals deal has specific provisions that, irregardless of minerals or what have you, Ukraine cannot sign a deal with China on certain provisions.
Now I've lost my thought. Actually, I had some questions.
Sorry, I gave too many things. Sorry.
Yeah.
In my simplistic little brain, Andrij, I've just got this one nagging question, right? Because if you are right in what you surmise about the longevity of this conflict, and if this continues to drag on, given the interdependencies, right, does this conflict escalate? I think that's the main question.
Yeah, and it doesn't go out of control, escalation. It's one thing if you're talking about escalating and they go from one village to the next, but what I'm worried about is the food supply being disrupted. I'm worried about the conflict exploding in terms of undersea gas lines in the Black Sea. There are many things that could all of a sudden increase prices around the world, and then you have the after effect. So this is one of the reasons why you want to, where let's say the theoretical idea that was proposed by President Trump during, or JD Vance, like, we're just gonna, when we win, we're gonna walk away from Ukraine and they're gonna have to have peace. What you don't want is the things to all of a sudden domino effect and go out of control. Let's say Russia just tore into Ukraine and all of a sudden the entire food system goes down, various other systems go. How does that affect a lot of things around the world? And does that embolden Russia to say do more stuff in the Baltic countries, which are also very wedded into the EU, not just their economy, but a lot of different systems? What does this mean for other conflicts around the world? This is the domino effect. Is you want to contain it right now. We are going in the opposite direction that we were at the end of the Biden administration. As much as people were complaining, me too, about how Biden was handling this war, we are going in the opposite direction that when we were at the end of 2024. And the Trump administration needs to figure out a way to stop that reversal, whether that's a swing for the fences, Shamsul, and get that home run and get the peace deal, or try to contain Putin again, because the warfare has changed. It's not the same kind of warfare that we had at the beginning. So you need different strategies, you need different weapons. The sanctions we put out at the beginning, they have changed. Russia has figured out ways to work around it. So we need different, if you're going to put sanctions on along with different weapons, you need to coordinate that together. But it's not the same playing field that we had in 2022. So as Mr. Trump said, you need the cards. We started playing poker, now we're playing cribbage. Like, we're playing a different game now.
So lest we forget, the First and Second World Wars were escalations of sorts, from small countries then became larger conflicts, and then it enveloped the world, right? Although some people say that we're actually in some kind of Third World War by now, it's not become a kinetic one, and I think that's the right. Where are the trigger points, in your opinion, from a macro standpoint, that might suggest we are escalating?
You mean to a world war? I think we're actually I did not think we were like that in 2023 or 2024, even when Russia was talking about about threatening nuclear weapons in Ukraine, or any European nation that wanted to help Ukraine. I think that we're closer to it now when we're talking about, look what's happening in the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. There are three northern countries, the closest to Moscow and St. Petersburg. I've driven across every single one of those countries. It takes 2.5 hours tops. They're much smaller land territory to occupy. And what's happening is that you have World War II style trenches being dug across the borders to prevent tanks from crossing over. This is happening in 2025 Europe today. Russia has been consistently putting cyber attacks against all of those countries. There have been targeted assassinations. There have been crimes of, this happens all over the world actually, crimes of mayhem, where Russia pays local youth or low-level criminals to burn warehouses, just disrupt things. And this ends up being tied into Russian outfits. Simply in the case of some of these places that they're burning down, maybe warehouses that supply humanitarian aid going to Ukraine, but they're acting with impunity on those territories. So where we are is that Russia seems not scared enough of the West to stop. They are going further in Ukraine. They are using new technology. Again, what the world did in response to 2022 is going to have to be different in terms of containing Russia in 25 and 26 if Russia continues to go forward. And for me, I always describe a world war as something not where a whole bunch of people get into a room and say, you're team A and you're team B, and now we fight. A world war happens when all of a sudden things happen, not in the countries directly related to it, but for me, 22 was a worry for a world war, when all of a sudden I was worried about the stability of Lebanon if food prices would skyrocket because of Ukraine. Same thing with Morocco and other countries. And all of a sudden you have a domino situation happening across the world where you can't put the stop button no matter what you do. And that to me is a world war. when things start going in a domino effect, and no matter how many countries say we want to get together and stop it, we can't. And that's what should be worrying President Trump, as well as other world leaders, about how to contain Russia so that we don't have any after effects boiling up somewhere else, where all of a sudden Russia, Ukraine keeps going on. Maybe China, Taiwan, who knows? But maybe something else blows up, and all of a sudden everybody's scrambling. Oh, we do not have enough weapons. We don't have enough soldiers. We don't have enough firefighters. If it's, say a big volcano blowing up somewhere, and all of a sudden the playing field changes again, and we can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Samuel?
I don't know. I'm getting there's a noise in the background, some construction work, I guess.
Not hearing anything. All good.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. Here's the thing. Okay, Andrij, based on what you're saying, let me ask you a quick, rapid question. What's your feeling right now for this? Because I have to use your word, I think what we're seeing is actually a swing for the fences from the Trump administration.
Yep.
Right. So if you look at it from that standpoint, on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you give the chances for peace?
Right now, I think we are lower than we were at the beginning of 2020, at the beginning of the Trump administration. I think he has swung for the fences, and it's still too fresh. The swinging for the fences is too fresh. We don't know whether what happened in the last week will have lasting effects, because I turn to let's talk about North Korea. Like that was a big swing for the fence, going to North Korea, going to the DMZ, and then going to Vietnam for the secondary summit. That ended with nothing. And in fact, North Korea has been kind of more recalcitrant over the last couple of years, even all the work that happened to it. So this is what happens with international affairs, especially when you're dealing with a rogue state. Steve Witkoff was brought into this administration to make deals, and he got the worst portfolio. Imagine being a business manager and say, you have to make deals with Hamas, Iran, and Russia. You figure out which one you're going to do first. And it's a problem when you're not dealing with, I mean, this is, you mentioned this earlier, Shamsul, when you're like, Trump is a businessman, he wants to go in, he wants to make a deal. And one of the reasons I bring in the war crimes is that you rarely have an instance where you can make a business deal with somebody who maybe is, not quite paid on their taxes. Maybe there's some shadiness on their business books, but an actual war crime thing, that person is willing to cross lines that you are not, and that's a problem. With all of Trump's bravado, I don't think he's ready to make war crimes around the world. But the other side is. And so when you're walking into a room like that, what are you going to use? Because in my opinion, any talk of nuclear is all bravado. I don't see anybody interested in using nuclear weapons. But in the end, what is the next step? How do you convince somebody that you're strong enough and mighty enough? That flyover was great. Iran was fantastic. We need an Iran for Ukraine. I don't want to bomb Iran like Trump did. But what Trump did was he changed the equation with Iran, right?
Yeah.
We need to fix. Trump needs an Iran for Ukraine, and I don't know what that is.
At this stage, I agree with you that I don't know what that is, to be honest.
Yeah.
Apart from actually shrinking their GDP further by doing all these secondary sanctions, so that there's no transshipment, right?
Yeah.
So when there's no transshipment,
what do you think? I think the oil cap has been pretty good for Russia, and I think it probably be more palatable for countries to have a cap on Russian oil as opposed to a full sanction regime. I think right now we've put an oil cap. Europe and other countries have agreed to an oil cap of no more than $50 a barrel. I think if we consistently lower that to 45, 40, 35, meaning Russia gets less and less money, good. It's good for the other countries. We still get oil, or India and China still gets oil, but we progressively pay less and less money to Russia. It's a slower way of doing things.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing. Actually, at the end of the day, whether they got whether this whole swing of the fences strategy is going to work. I think we've got. I'm going to give it maybe if they're going to have a three-party meeting, or between the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. I think I would wait for that and wait and see on that, because otherwise, like you say, how much further are you going to do sanctions? I mean, you can do the way you said it, but it's going to take it's going to be a slow process as well, right?
Well, there are already sanctions that Europe has put on institutions that the United States hasn't. The United States hasn't updated their sanctions as often as Europe has, which was the reverse. Under Biden, the United States was always the first one. Now Europe has surged ahead because Trump has been waiting with Putin, meaning that we have sanctions as whack-a-mole. You have to sanction one company, and then Russia will put all their business in another one, and then you have to keep going and listing all the companies you want to sanction because they haven't been done sectorally. All the Russian banks aren't cut off from SWIFT. Most banks are cut off from SWIFT. So there's enough ways to work around the sanctions. There's, for me, here's an interesting thing. The longer this goes, and the less likely that or Putin plays, I think one thing that Putin does not want to see is U.S. people visiting Ukraine, because but the Biden visit was historic. No president in a war zone, blah, blah, blah. But every time any of Trump's people, his pastor, Mark Burns, Ben Shapiro went there this summer, anytime a MAGA voice goes there and sees what's happening, they come back and say, we need to double whatever we're sending. And I think Putin is very worried about that. I've been saying, I was on MSNBC in 2019 when the scandal broke for Trump's call with Zelenskyy. And I at that point, I was like, Trump needs to go to Ukraine right now. Trump would be beloved in Ukraine. Trump's visit to Poland is the reason that today he wins Polish vote in the United States by 80%. So Trump would be fantastic in Ukraine. He would go visit the front. You know how he is in U.S. military bases. He makes jokes. He talks to people. He's very good with talking with veterans. I think if he were to go to Ukraine, he would be, first of all, gangbusters for all of Europe. PR, fantastic. But second of all, if anybody from his cabinet, including him, were to go visit Ukraine, they would come back with a very different opinion about what to do. And this is one of the key criticisms of J.D. Vance when he confronted Zelenskyy in the White House, is that J.D. Vance hasn't visited that part of the world. He has no idea of the realities on the ground. If they were to visit, they would have a very different sense about what's happening. And that's something that Putin does not want to happen. So the longer we wait without a deal, the more likely it is that some more members of the cabinet are going to visit, like Scott Bessent, who just signed the minerals agreement, and now he wants to sign the drone agreement with Ukraine. I think Putin does not want members of the cabinet going to Ukraine and seeing how bad it is from all the Russian attacks, and how much more the United States could be doing.
John?
I don't know how much more of your time we have, Andre, and I know you guys have been getting quite granular about the developments in the Ukraine, but I always try and look at it from the human point of view and from the ordinary person, right? And I know that you are a sounding board for many people in America about what's happening in Ukraine.
Sure.
When you talk to people on the street or on TV, or just anybody who's got anything at stake in terms of what's happening, what do you tell them? I mean, what do you tell them about how to prepare, how to fortify themselves against what's happening in that part of the world, especially as you suggest, it's not getting any better.
Well, first, I try to have as many frank conversations about what's happening, and I MC a lot of charity events for Ukrainian organizations that benefit charitable organizations in Ukraine, and sometimes they're at fancy museums, sometimes they're hosted by symphonies, etc. And I always say, what are you comfortable with me talking about? Can I talk about the rape that's happening? Can I talk, just to make it very real that we're talking, we can be talking about something that's very far away, but when we talk about the actual specific realities of people, the people who have lost, this one woman that I met on one trip to Ukraine, we ended up being on the same train car together. She couldn't have been older than 22 years old. Very soft-spoken, but I'm a talker, so I will talk to anybody. And she eventually opened up. and she was from Mariupol, that city that is an occupied territory where Azovstal was, and it was the last area that Russia had to defeat to take over that entire slice of land to Crimea. And she said, yeah, I'm from Mariupol. And I said, what do you do now? All I do now is raise money to send to the guys that are going to kill. She specifically said, kill Russians, not win the war, kill Russians. So she showed me on her phone her house that she used to live in, where a rocket went through and destroyed it. If her parents had been in one room and not the other, they would be dead. She talks about driving when she delivers fresh food to people on the front line, and she's driving on the same roads she's driven on for years. But if she were only to take that right, she would be driving back to her home, which is on the other side of the front line. And she knows she can never see that because her home, for all intents and purposes, is gone. So there are 12 cities of 100,000 or less that are completely gone. They're just leveled. They just don't exist anymore. That's these are the realities for people. When people said that we just want a land swap, we're talking about a complete change. A lot of this territory, like Crimea, will be depopulated. It will be turned into mostly a military occupied area with no real economy of its own. Maybe some of those coal mines and coke processing centers will be used to export things to Russia, but it really won't be at the same level of population and GDP activity that it had before. And for those people, that's a very real life thing. The people who either live there and are somewhere else, the people they know who died there. We still don't have a full count of how many people are buried there. We know how many people died because Ukraine allows UN human rights people to document that. But we have, other than seeing mass graves by satellite images, we've never had anybody confirm how many people have been killed in those occupied territories. So it's talking about when you're talking about land swaps, from the Russian side is we want territory. From the Ukrainian side is we want the 1.6 children who are living in those occupied territories to have freedom. And that's a question.
Chuang, it's very interesting listening to Andrij on this part, right? What thought come to my mind was, for people like ourselves or even our parents, right? The thought of war has never. It's such a concept. We've never tasted any such misery in our life. Chuang, I mean, I'm looking at things from a very conceptual standpoint. I'm looking at things from a point of view of, okay, I'm here for business. How do I get this business done, right? So that we can move on, And maybe to a certain extent, we lost the appreciation of the human part of it, which, I can be very, I can be very offhanded when I talk about all these conflicts, to be honest, because, to be very sincere about it, we really have no comprehension of war, Chuang.
Well, actually, I have a little bit because my father was born in 1940, and back in the day, World War II, the Japanese invaded Malaysia, and they basically ran through Penang, and Shamsul and I, Sam, both of us are from that part of the world, and the Kembatai actually they occupied my old house, and they essentially raped local girls, and the house that I lived in subsequently in the late 70s was actually haunted, very badly haunted by the souls of the young girls that was raped by the Kembatai of the Japanese, secret service in the 40s. And my father recalls a time when the Japanese used to roam the streets of Penang in Malaysia, and my father would hide in the cupboards, and they would basically piss themselves through fear, because if they were caught and they were suspected of being spies for the British, they would be beheaded, and there were basically heads of beheaded people on spikes in Penang. And I mean, they talk about these things, but Sam and I, we've lived through this golden era of prosperity and contentment and abundant food and all these things. We have no idea what's going on in the Ukraine. I mean, we've got no bloody clue. You know what I mean?
I think this is a great reason to talk to older people. So my father lived for the World War II. His 9th birthday was the invasion of Poland by Germany, the Nazis and the Soviets at the same time. So he lived through the 3-week bombing of Western Ukraine. Then it was Eastern Poland. He was rounded up by Germans at the end of their occupation. Sorry, you mentioned people occupied houses. So the house that he lived in when the Germans and Nazis invaded, the Nazis and the Soviets invaded together, because that's how the war started. The Germans helped with the bombing, but the Russians occupied that territory. So everybody had to move one floor up, because the Soviets took the ground floor. Then the Nazis came and attacked the Soviets, and then everybody had to move 2 floors up because the Nazis wanted 2 floors. But in the end, when he was 11 or 12, he was rounded up by Nazis, and they would have these things called Lapanka, where they sent trucks around and they would try to convince boys to come with us. We'll give you food and stuff. It'll be like a camp. And so they, much like the stolen children today, they would round up boys to work and set up telephone poles as a 12-year-old in Germany. And then he was actually, my father was introduced to a German family that would have adopted him and make him Aryan. And this is what the basis of one of the Nuremberg trials after the war was. I think it was trial 8, where they were talking about how the Nazis were not only the other things about the final solution and killing people in death camps, but they were also looking at stealing children, like it's happening today in Russia stealing Ukraine, and integrating them into German society by erasing their history, erasing their names, teaching them a new language, etc. So you're right that a lot of us don't remember or haven't lived through that time. And that's the question I have every day, Shamsul, when we're talking about U.S. domestic policy, because that's a big question about, trade. We've lived in a basically free trade in the world for the last 30 years. We're entering a new era that a lot of people who are younger haven't done business in an era of tariffs, etc. So now we're going back to a little bit of that. But in terms of open war, unless you're talking about specific people who lived through civil war in their countries or different conflicts that have raged for many years, we can't forget what's happened in Southeast Asia for decades. Many parts of sub-Saharan Africa had been in open conflict for decades. Unless you're from those parts of the world, the wealthy part of the world has been in a very safe place. I think that's the question when people like to very easily complain about why isn't Europe have a big military? I was like, because the United States never wanted Europe to have a military again after 1,000 years of war on the European continent. The fact that France is not a military power, and that nobody of a certain age understands France as the country of Napoleon, or the country that's occupied had territories just like England and the Spanish Empire had all over the world. The fact that younger people don't even realize that France was such an occupying power up until Germany vanquished it in World War II. That's not the norm in history. The norm in history is that many of these European countries are international behemoths of military and financial power. And we have just been lucky that for 100 years or 80 years, we've kept that sleeping tiger or sleeping lion asleep. And who knows, if we remilitarize Germany and France, what happens?
Shit.
I got really dark,
right.
Didn't I?
Bloody hell, man. If I can speak on behalf of Sam, I think we've taken a lot of your time, Andrij.
And
if I could, take liberties on behalf of Sam and the Gutshot podcast to offer you a lifetime honorary invitation to appear on the Gutshot podcast, because I think geopolitical conflict is not going to go anywhere soon. Now, not in the next 5 or 10 years. And we need lucid, well-spoken, perspective-driven, well-researched individuals like yourself to offer viewpoints for people like us in this part of the world to try and make sense of what's going on. And I don't know whether that's appropriate, Sam, because I've spoken on our behalf, to invite Andrij on the Gutshot podcast whenever, anywhere, whenever we want to talk about this.
Sam, how about this? How about I guarantee you that we're going to do election coverage in 2028 in America, and I'll give you everything I can.
We might well be there. We might well be there with you in America.
That's a plan. That's an absolute plan, Andrij. That's an absolute plan. No, thank you so much. I think it's illuminating as well for me, because I and you know me, we've been talking for quite a few months,
Yeah.
and I look at the world very much from a businessman standpoint, right? And you know, I look at conflicts and how it affects commerce, and how to a certain extent, half of me is looking at how do I navigate that to my benefit, you know.
Yeah.
So I think this different perspective is extremely good. I think let's do this again on some other topics, or
I'd
continuing
love
on
to.
this.
Love to. Thank
Thanks
you
a
so
lot,
much.
Andrij. Hey, I wish I
Okay.
could be down in New York, but you know,
I'm actually so this weekend is Ukrainian Independence Day on Sunday, so I'm going to do a flag raising with the mayor of New York on Thursday, and then that night I have to fly to Chicago to do independence events in Chicago. So I'm not even going to be in New York for the rest of the week. So I'm going to do a lot of events in Chicago, and probably just a lot of press as I've been doing for Ukrainian Independence Day.
Nice.
All right,
Okay.
man. Thank you so
So
much.
shall we thank him so much? Yes, Andrij, thanks a lot. Nice seeing you.
And thank you for even proposing this. It was a great conversation. I'd love to do it again, and good luck with everything you guys are doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, buddy.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.